Unit 4. How do we understand symbols in apocalyptic literature? Well, by first of all asking, what is a symbol? You see a small sample here of religious symbols. No doubt some of them you recognize. Probably one or more of them you don't recognize. They are foreign to you. Each of them stands for a religion. Some of them also stand for a belief that is central to that religion. That illustrates what a symbol is. It is something that stands for something else. Usually it takes the form of an object or a sign, and it stands for and represents something else. What was that? Well, it was Morse code. In this case, the symbols are sound patterns representing letters. And in order to understand what is being communicated, you need the key to decode. You actually see it here, the International Morse code alphabet. See if you can get the message now. You may have known it already. It's SOS, a call for help. The symbols in apocalyptic language also make up a code. In order to understand what is being communicated, we have to decode the symbolic language, the symbolic code. And to do that, we need the key. So one of the aims in this unit is to think about the key to apocalyptic symbolism. But first, let's look at a few more familiar symbols. Here's one that everyone knows. It's part of a worldwide language. It stands for an emotion, or for my attitude towards something. I like it. By the way, this illustrates the advantage of symbols. Once we've become acquainted with the code, with the key, it opens a powerful channel of communication. Here's another symbol in the same style, signifying the opposite emotion. Now if I add one more symbol, I turn this into a story. A very simple story, but a story nevertheless. Additional symbol is an arrow, which stands for something like sequence or result. And this is the story. I was happy, then something happened. That is why it's a story. I have no idea what. The story doesn't tell us. And then I ended up being unhappy. That is the story. Very simple, but a story nevertheless. And completely told using symbols, no words. Now, on a more complex level, that is what the Book of Revelation does. Telling a story by means of symbols. Of course, there are all sorts of other symbols that we are familiar with. This one is a national symbol in the form of a flag. It represents Canada. Animals can be used symbolically. This one is the bald eagle, and you may immediately connect it with the United States. Even though many countries have an eagle as their symbol, it's often either an eagle or a lion. The fox, in my culture at least, stands for slyness. It's a very shrewd, tricky animal. That may be different in your culture, and you may not even have foxes where you come from. So that's a more difficult symbol to use. This is a lamb, and that is of course a symbol that appears in the Book of Revelation. It represents Jesus, which doesn't mean that Jesus looks like a lamb, and he's certainly not a lamb in any literal sense of the word. But he is like a lamb in some way. In what way? Think Old Testament. The lamb is linked with the idea of sacrifice, and with the Passover and the Passover lamb, the lamb that was killed on the day of Passover, and then its blood was put on the door in Egypt to keep the angel of death out, protecting those inside of the house. That is how Jesus is our sacrifice and our Passover lamb. Colors can also be used in symbolic ways. White is the color of purity or victory, especially victory. Red is the color of blood. Black is the color of death. Names can also be used symbolically, as they are in the book of Revelation. Geographical names like Jerusalem, Babylon, Sodom, Egypt likely do not refer to that location, but carry a symbolic meaning, as does the name Jezebel, and most likely also Armageddon, as we will see when we get there. And then there are numbers. Now, we don't normally use numbers in symbolic ways, the way the book of Revelation does, but you may have noticed that a few numbers appear often. Most numbers don't appear at all. And then there are some special numbers that don't appear often in the book, but really make you wonder, what do they mean? 144,000, 1260, 666. Well, we will come back to numbers because we will need a separate key to decode the symbolic meaning of numbers in Revelation. Before I say more about numbers, let's first talk about the story, the plot of the book of Revelation. We have here the story of a battle between light and darkness, between good and evil, and on the side of evil there is a sort of trinity involved, a trinity of evil. There's the dragon, there's the beast from the sea that looks a lot like the dragon, and there's a second beast, the beast from the land, which looks like a lamb, but it talks like a dragon, giving away its true nature. Now, these three are major players on the side of evil. In addition, there are two women involved. One is a prostitute and the other one is a bride. There are also two cities. One is Babylon, associated with the side of evil, and the other is Jerusalem, associated with what's light and good. In the book, these representatives of evil are introduced to us in a particular order, and then we hear about their demise in the opposite order. Now, in Revelation 12, we are first introduced to the dragon. In Revelation 13, we get to see the two beasts. And it's only in chapter 17 that Babylon the Great, the city, the harlot or prostitute, is introduced to us, and this is immediately followed by Babylon's destruction. Then in chapter 19, the two beasts are destroyed, and in chapter 20, we read about the end and destruction of the dragon. That, in a nutshell, is the story of the second half of the book of Revelation. It's not really complicated, is it? At this point, I've hardly said anything about what these symbols in the book of Revelation actually mean. That will have to wait until we get there in the text. But I do want to say something about where we find the key, or rather the keys, since there's more than one, that we need to decode these symbols. The first kind of key is given to us by John himself. He explains some of the symbols in his book, which is very helpful. For instance, the 7 lampstands in chapter 1. He tells us they are the 7 churches. And the 7 stars in the right hand of Jesus, they are the 7 angels of the churches. Now, what that means is less clear, but at least we know what those 7 stars stand for. The dragon is explained to us quite extensively, both in chapter 12 and in chapter 20. So for some symbols, John gives us the key right there in the book. For others, we have to turn to the Old Testament. You may have noticed that there's a lot of material from the Old Testament somehow reused, recycled by John in Revelation. Easily 2/3 of the book include something from the Old Testament. Or to be more precise, by one estimate, out of just over 400 verses, 278 include some allusion or reference to the Old Testament. John is truly recycling it, redefining and reframing it around Christ. He doesn't just copy it. He gives things new or changed meanings. But in order to understand his meaning for his symbols, we often have to turn to the Old Testament to find where it comes from and then to understand what John means with it, or what the vision means with it. So the Old Testament is an important source of keys. And then in some cases, the key comes from the first century world. That's harder because we don't have access to it and we may not be aware of certain things. But the background is at times found in the Roman Empire, its culture, circumstances back then. And then perhaps one thing to add, an important key, whenever we read about animals or monsters, we are usually to think of empires and rulers, sometimes of spiritual powers in the sense of the dragon as Satan and the lamb as Jesus. But in other cases, and this goes back to the book of Daniel, where there are 4 animals representing 4 kingdoms and their ruler. Or in other cases, besides the dragon and the lamb, in apocalyptic literature, animals and monsters stand for an empire or its ruler. Before I finish, a word about numbers in the book of Revelation. Obviously, there are a lot of them. Some numbers don't appear often, but they do intrigue us, like the 144,666, and then 1260 days, which happens to equal 42 months, which makes 3.5 years. There are the numbers 1600 and 7000, and then there are a few numbers that appear a lot in the book. They include 7, 12, 10, and 4. Now these 4 numbers are perhaps not quite so difficult. 12 is the number of tribes in Israel, the number of the apostles. It's a number connected with God's people. 7 days of the week, it stands for fullness, completion, perfection. And then 10, we have 10 fingers. And it also stands for a certain completion, but not necessarily perfection. 4, well, there are the 4 corners of the earth, the 4 directions of the compass. This number stands for the earth, the physical world. Some of the other numbers that I have written down here actually are composite numbers. One that I didn't write down is 1000 years, which is 10 times 10 times 10. It stands for a very long, complete time period. 144,000 is 12 times 12 times 1000. 7,000 is 7 times 1000. And then there is 4 times 4 times 10 times 10, 1600. So you can see that really there's only a few numbers used over and over again in the book. Most numbers never make it